Hello, I'm William Critchley. Welcome to my course on sustainable land management. The focus is on developing countries in the tropics, but the principles and many of the practices are valid worldwide. I hope that you will enjoy it, learn a lot, and be stimulated to find out more. There are references and a glossary to help you along your way. So here is the programme. It's very wide-ranging. That's because sustainable land management, or SLM, is a very broad topic, and it has become broader as concerns of ecosystem destruction and climate change have emerged. I have exactly half a century of work experience. I was born in the UK and began my career in Kenya as a volunteer in 1973. I've travelled to more than 50 countries for work, though Africa has been my main focus. I wanted to help the poorest people. I still do. And that's the reason that I've designed this course. Everywhere I've gone, I've met welcoming and friendly people. I've always listened and watched and never stopped learning. I shall be illustrating the classes with lessons from these countries. I am still the idealist I was at the start, just tempered with a little bit more realism. But now, alas, my travelling days are over. So it's time to pass on the baton to the next generation. I've used pictures and stories from around the world, based on my own experience, first as a volunteer and later working with organisations including Oxfam, the World Bank, FAO and IFAD, and of course the Free University Amsterdam. It has been updated from my university and other training courses. Now it's a voluntary course, it's supplied for free and there is no official accreditation. My hope, though, is that it will be a useful introduction for those of you who want to learn more. I thank everyone who gave me the chance to formulate these materials. I accept responsibility for the content unless referenced, and all the photos are mine unless otherwise stated. There are 3 general reading background publications, and you will also see how you can reference the course itself. I trust you to do so and not to reproduce without asking me. Here's today's roadmap. We'll begin with the problem, land degradation. The 2 main processes will be covered next, and then we will examine the underlying causes. We'll conclude with the historical context and how sustainable land management emerged as a solution. So, what's the main issue? Well, here it is. More than 3 billion in developing countries depend directly on the land. Among them are 70% of the world's very poor, and the expected 10 billion people by 2050 will need to be fed while protecting the land through sustainable land management. What makes me so sad is that in 1973 I thought we were on the verge of ending hunger. The Green Revolution in Asia was in full swing, and surely the tide was turning. But no, even more people are hungry today, and that's simply unacceptable. Here's one illustration of the core problem, land degradation. And the solution, sustainable land management. The summary definitions here are not official. They're mine, but they may help you. Here are 2 lessons I learnt about how much farmers value soil. First, dredging sediment from a lake in Indonesia to carry uphill to sell. And second, a farmer in India who's dug soil out of the forest. But surely it's best and cheapest to keep, than improve soil in the fields themselves. Do be aware that land is not the same as soil. It's a much broader concept. Land encompasses the soil, plus the vegetation and all the biota that are on it and in it. So land includes the smallest microorganisms, as well as insects and earthworms, and some people would say larger animals too. It includes the water that runs through it also. If English is not your first language, I wonder if you have similar terms. Just think about it. Here is the official definition of land degradation, as set out by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. I've added my own short description also: land losing its ability to function. In South Africa, some 15 years or so ago, I came across a student comparing present-day landscapes with photos from the 1930s. It appeared that degradation had happened, but the environment had reached an equilibrium. That led me to realize that degraded and degrading are not necessarily the same thing. So, how big is the problem? Well, here's one of the most reliable sources: the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The data, of course, can never be absolutely accurate, and more recent data, in fact, is not significantly different. This, I think, is the clearest overview. It's clear that there is a serious problem, but equally, nearly half of the land surface is basically in quite good condition, or at least improving. Not everyone accepts that the situation is acute, and there was a school of thought that emerged some 25–30 years ago that said we were exaggerating the problem. Well, that may be true in some situations, and indeed I've recorded some spectacular recovery myself, but let's not lose sight of the fact that land degradation is a huge danger, and we see it everywhere. Michael Stocking was one of my PhD supervisors. He was an astute man. To him, land degradation was a massive problem for us all, but especially for the poorest people who depend on the land for their livelihoods. And now the official definition of desertification. It's a much misused and misunderstood term. It is not ever marching deserts. Deserts, in fact, tend to expand and contract and so forth. Desertification is land degradation in dry areas, and it is land degradation to the extent that it's very difficult to bring that land back into productivity. Now let's look at some important differences in the semi-arid area in Africa. Drought is a temporary but longer than usual period of dry weather. The dry season occurs every year and may appear to be a drought, but when the rains come in the wet season, within a week or two the whole area can be transformed. Desertification, however, is when the land is so degraded it doesn't even respond to the rainfall. Note that land degradation, or more precisely soil degradation after vegetation has been degraded, can be broadly divided into two processes: soil erosion and nutrient mining. There can be pollution also, but that's outside the scope of our course. While soil erosion is basically movement of soil, there are some important concepts you need to be familiar with. Look at this slide carefully. Erosion may be natural or accelerated. Erosion can be categorized into surface erosion or mass wasting. And erosion is either selective or non-selective. And here are two important words to remember: erodible, that's the vulnerability of soil to erosion, and erosive, the ability of rainfall to cause erosion. And because soils in the tropics are so erodible, especially on unprotected slopes, and tropical rain so intense, thus erosive, well, that is one reason why there is so much soil erosion in these regions. Let's pick up on one of these categories now. Non-selective erosion means that all the soil to a certain depth is eroded. Landslides, gullies, and small gullies or rills are all forms of non-selective erosion. Tillage erosion is also included in this category. When soil is dug or ploughed, it tends to move down slope. In contrast, selective erosion is quite different. This occurs when rainfall splash or runoff removes just the finer particles of soil, leaving the larger bits behind. Since the finer clay and silt particles are the richest in terms of plant nutrients, this type of erosion is much more damaging than it appears to be. Now, the relative richness of the particles eroded in selective erosion can be expressed as an enrichment ratio. In this example, pictured from Belize in Central America, the eroded sediment at the bottom of the field is approximately 5 times as rich as the source material at the top of the field. So selective erosion can be very damaging. Soil erosion causes problems at various scales: infield, within a catchment, and downstream. At the global level, soil erosion means a large loss of carbon, because as soil is moved, its organic carbon is exposed to the atmosphere and it is oxidized to carbon dioxide, the chief greenhouse gas. Here are 2 examples of negative impacts, both from Kenya. In the first, soil has lost its fertility and water holding capacity through many years of erosion. In the second, soil erosion in a river catchment has meant that the land cannot store water and floods have occurred. A bridge has been fatally damaged. But as with many things in the natural world, there are 2 sides to the coin. Sediments from soil erosion account for the fertility that we see in floodplains and alongside river banks. Here are examples from Morocco and Sudan. Egypt's agriculture, of course, relies almost entirely on eroded sediment from the mountains of East Africa. And now on to the second of the main processes, nutrient mining. Nutrient mining is hidden. It simply means soil being stripped of its fertility gradually and continuously. The pictures here show examples of soil nutrients being exported. Top left, we have bananas being carried to the city, grass also being taken to the city for cattle feed, and finally manure being taken to a village to be burnt as fuel. So, what are the numbers? This schematic shows what the main losses are and where the very limited gains come from. An average net loss in sub-Saharan Africa was around 50 kilograms of nutrients per hectare per year in the very early 21st century. Since then, fertilizer use has risen from about 10 kilograms to an estimated 17 kilograms per hectare, bringing that figure down a little. It's a huge issue. But looking at both columns, you will see how SLM fits in and helps. The key question is what triggers land degradation? Well, the underlying cause is when forest, or at least the original vegetative cover, has been removed and soil is left exposed to rain, to runoff, and to wind. Thus, deforestation is where land degradation usually begins. There's another form of land use change that also leads to land degradation. That's where land is built over with houses and roads. Often this is in areas with good farmland, and it's a one-way process, irreversible. This slide is worth looking at in some detail, because neither forest nor deforestation are easy to define, nor are they simple to measure. So forest is not just a large number of trees, and deforestation may be complete removal of forest, but in fact forest degradation is even more widespread and important. One of the most important points is that the forest floor is key to forest function. Even where there are enough trees, it's what's underneath them that counts. The broken branches, leaf litter, and accumulated organic matter are vital to hydrological function and biodiversity, and they contain a large amount of carbon as well. In Ethiopia, around churches, the removal of trees is forbidden, so we have a glimpse of what the forest used to look like. Now these church forests are just isolated islands, but at least they harbour a vital gene pool and act as a valuable seed bank. Another question: why deforest at all? Trees have historically been removed to make way for farmland. As long as that was in proportion, it didn't matter. But as the population has grown and more forests have been removed, it's become a very serious problem. Here is a list of the negative consequences. We've picked out 3 of them here: damage to ecosystem function and service provision, the loss of carbon, and of course the potential to sequester carbon, and the loss of biodiversity. Now, 3 examples of deforestation and the damage that it can cause. In Papua New Guinea, forest has been stripped and burned for cropping on a steep and vulnerable slope. Charcoal is being made in Uganda from indigenous forest trees. Just look at the logs being used. And in Ethiopia we see the result: runoff deeply coloured by sediment. Just like land degradation, facts and figures regarding deforestation must be treated with care. We've noted that there are only estimates, and definitions of deforestation can be interpreted differently. Deforestation is taking place, however the overall picture appears not as bad as it was, because more trees are being planted worldwide. But that conceals one very important point. Planting trees often means softwood species in plantations, and these do not compensate for the tropical forests that are being felled. It's not simply a mathematical calculation. Losing tropical forests means losing their rich biodiversity and ecosystem function, as well as the carbon that they store. Nevertheless, some researchers think that, in Africa at least, deforestation is being exaggerated. And there is growing evidence that farmers are planting many more trees within their farms. Well, that's got to be good news. But once again, trees in farms are not the same as the original forest. Let's focus once more on the lot of vital tropical forests. A student of mine from West Africa was concerned that legal logging concessions were actually doing far more environmental damage than small-scale logging, which was officially banned. Large-scale logging often means damage to the forest floor by dragging logs and spilling oil from barrels. Watercourses are polluted, and main roads are being damaged as well. Small-scale loggers are ironically more careful. This is not an argument for illegal logging, though, even on a small scale. So, how do we limit the damage done by deforestation? Well, there are rules and regulations and technical guidelines to better logging practices. But to protect forests, one imaginative method is to hand over forest management to communities and allow them to use some non-timber forest products, for example honey, fruits or plant-based medicines, in exchange for protecting the trees and, of course, the forest floor. You can study about joint forest management in the 2007 WOCAT book, edited by Hans-Peter Linniger and myself. Communities protect the forest from illegal logging, but also from grazing and browsing by livestock, following their own rules and regulations. And do be aware of how farmers and other land users manage trees in the landscape. Observe carefully and you'll see them pruning by coppicing, meaning harvesting new shoots or poles from the trunk and allowing regrowth. Please, by the way, consult the glossary for any technical terms that are new to you. Another technique is a specific form of pollarding. That's trimming side branches to encourage straight trunks. Or sometimes selectively removing species that are of no value. And, of course, protecting naturally germinated seedlings. Certification and labeling of timber products helps consumers. This proves that wood is from a sustainable source. Buyers can then make an informed decision before purchasing furniture, for example. But, oh dear, it's not always so clear. I bought some garden chairs about 20 years ago. Here they are. I asked for the certificate. Here it is. And it shows that they're made of teak grown in a plantation in Java. But what I know is that teak plantations are nothing like proper, original, mixed indigenous forests. There's often no litter under the trees, and runoff simply flows away, carrying sediment with it. The Clean Development Mechanism and REDD or REDD Plus, see the glossary once again, are international arrangements that give support to maintenance of forest cover. You may like to study these in detail. If so, look up the references. Imitating or recreating forest floor conditions is a guiding principle in sustainable land management. So even where forest has been cleared, farmers or other land users can re-establish healthy conditions based on keeping the soil covered with mulch and vegetation. They can also plant trees in their land, and that's agroforestry. Here's the roadmap again. We've covered the problem, the cause, and the processes. But before we move on to sustainable land management itself, we need to understand its history. Where did it emerge from? Modern concerns about soil erosion can be traced back to the early 20th century. America's Great Dust Bowl was the pivotal event. It triggered the establishment of the US Soil Conservation Service, and this attracted colonial authorities to do the same. The American author John Steinbeck wrote his classic novel The Grapes of Wrath on the theme of the Great Dust Bowl. Farmland was buried by windswept dust, and families had to migrate away from Oklahoma. Here's a quote that I used to read out to my students. To Oklahoma the last rains came gently, and they did not cut the scarred earth. The clouds appeared and went away, and in a little while they did not try any more. The wind grew stronger. The rain crust broke, and the dust lifted up out of the fields. The finest dust did not settle back to earth now, but disappeared into the darkening sky. An even blanket covered the earth. Soil conservation schemes were introduced in Africa and Asia. but most of them collapsed because they were closely associated with colonialism. Soil conservation, in fact, was seen as punishment. But after independence, many countries reintroduced conservation schemes when they saw the damage that erosion was causing. But those schemes often failed too. We'll look at the reasons why shortly. One problem was that the Green Revolution, which fed millions, served as a misleading model. The Green Revolution was founded on a simple combination of better crop varieties, external inputs, irrigation, and advice to farmers. But the same recipe, so to speak, could not be applied to soil conservation in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Here was a much more complex problem, and the early approaches were doomed to failure. Success only came with a new approach based on conservation through production. So, back to those post-colonial conservation schemes that failed. Why was that? Well, here are some of the main reasons. Soil conservation was still associated with colonialism, projects were too short and too expensive, there was concern only with soil loss, and farmers were seen as damaging and ignorant. These are just 4 points that I picked out from this slide. This is a photograph I took during my early days in Kenya. The Soil Conservation Extension Officer is dressed in uniform and people are being instructed on what to do. A top-down approach. It was not popular. Nowadays we're moving much more towards participatory approaches where there is dialogue between the specialists and the land users. A much better idea. Research trials were invariably within research stations, not on farmers' fields, where they would have been much more relevant. Here are some research plots in India measuring runoff and erosion from different slopes. It's really very hard to believe that this was an extract from a university textbook of mine. But this summarized the attitude that was taken by agricultural advisors. By me too, I have to say, for a year or two, before I realized that it was absolute nonsense. Of course, it's women as much or more than men who are central to small-scale farming. Later in my career, I focused on local farmer innovation and women at the top of the list, because that's very often where the best ideas were coming from. So back to soil conservation. After all the failures, are we still stuck in the mud? Is this the right road? What indeed is the way forward? Lots of lessons to learn, and the next few slides summarize them. Possibly the first is the most important, a change in focus from erosion and loss of soil to land productivity. That makes sense to land users. It's conservation through production. And this woman farmer from Uganda helps to illustrate a number of points under the new approach. This is zero grazing of dairy cattle, and control of free-roaming livestock in humid areas is a transformative keystone in resource conservation. And here's another list. Study these points. They will come back as our course continues. The last one is absolutely key. People don't necessarily need ownership of land, but will only look after natural resources if they have secure rights to their use. About 25 years ago now, there was a widespread campaign led by some prominent institutions to promote vetiver grass. It worked well as a vegetative barrier, stopping the soil moving downslope. But farmers didn't like it. They couldn't feed it to their animals. They much preferred Napier grass. Napier grass, in East Africa that is, was equally effective at stopping erosion, but excellent fodder too. So what's the lesson? listen to farmers and acknowledge that production is their priority. And in this next list, we can focus on the last point, the emergence of sustainable land management, which embodies all of these new concepts. It's important also to reflect how land conservation has become an international concern. We have realized that land degradation leads to loss of carbon. It's a major climate change issue. I used to say to my students, if you don't understand SLM yet, just look at this picture. It's not natural forest, but it's land use which is almost as good. Here are some takeaway points for you, but I hope that you will have been making your own list also. Next class explores how SLM works, with a focus on humid areas and urban settings also. So, looking forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.